code, and our moderator assistants will going to post the direct link where you can post your questions for speakers that you want the answers from. So let me introduce the moderator for the session. The moderator for the session is Dr. Mayuk Dewan. He's from Telis University, Malaysia. We'll be moderating this entire session. I'll be taking the questions for the speakers at the end of the session. Over to you, Dr. Mayuk. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Rupam. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all 168 people in this session at the moment. Welcome to the third day of the CRIT Summer School. I will introduce both the speakers, and I will also introduce the session, the topic of the session today. We were supposed to have 3 speakers, but one of our speakers got ill. So you may have noticed that at the moment we have 2 speakers only. We hope she gets better soon, and hopefully she can join us in the future sessions. All right. So the topic today is heritage tourism. Now, what exactly is heritage tourism? Historical or heritage tourism basically means traveling with the primary purpose of exploring the history and heritage of a place. It may mean simply sightseeing of renowned historical architecture, visiting local museums that document through artifacts, art, literary remains, or even something as quaint as sampling authentic historical recipes in the place of origin. People usually combine their love for history with other tourist delights like shopping, amusement park visits, luxury resort stays, etc. Now, the United Nations World Heritage, the UNESCO World Heritage Sustainable Tourism Program has a vision that World Heritage and tourism stakeholders share responsibility for the conservation of our common cultural and natural heritage of outstanding universal value and for sustainable development through appropriate tourism management. In line with this vision, we've got 2 excellent speakers today. I'll introduce our first speaker. I have Professor Dr. Dallen J. Timothy. He is a professor of community resources and development at Arizona State University and a senior sustainability scientist at the Julie Ann Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability. He's also a senior research associate at the University of Johannesburg, South Africa, Furlong professor at Hunan Normal University, China, visiting professor at Guangxi University, China, and guest professor in the Erasmus European Masters of Tourism Management program based in University of Girona, Spain. Prof. Timothy is the founding editor of Editor-in-Chief of Journal of Heritage Tourism and is commissioning editor for Routledge Cultural Heritage and Tourism book series and co-commissioning editor over 3 book series at Channel View Publications. He has also served on the editorial board of 25 international social science journals. He has published 37 books and over 250 articles and chapters on many aspects of tourism. So without taking much time, I'll give the digital floor to Prof. Timothy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mayuk. That was a very nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody at the CREET Summer School session this year. I appreciate all of those who have organized this conference and this summer school, and I'm sure that it's been a great experience for all the participants, and I hope it will continue to be. Greetings from Arizona, USA, where it's a very hot summer evening, and I am looking forward to hearing Dr. Raymond's presentation after mine, and I do hope that Professor Dr. Jana will start feeling better soon so that she can join us later. Again, thank you again for the invitation to be here. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here with you. I'm going to go ahead and start by sharing my screen, and thank you, Dr. Mayuk, for that very good introduction to heritage tourism. And basically, he covered my all bases so I don't need to do too much with that regard, but I'm going to define heritage tourism a little bit differently, although it fits perfectly with what Dr. Mayuk already mentioned. So if we'll start out by, basically, I want to talk about the capacity or the ability of heritage tourism to help communities meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Every form of tourism can be sustainably managed and planned. Every form of tourism can be a pro-poor tourism. Every form of tourism can be a community-based form of tourism. And heritage tourism obviously is no exception to that. Sorry, just 1 second. I need to grab my phone so that I can see the time. Okay. So heritage, I'd like to define a few things for you just to set the groundwork for this. Basically, heritage, what is it? And I think this is a complex phenomenon that a lot of people don't understand. What is heritage? Heritage is whatever we as humans inherit from the past, what we use and value today in the present, and what we hope to pass on to future generations. So this is a very broad definition. It's a very encompassing definition. And within that, and this is not my own definition, it's a definition that I put together based on discussions over many, many years. But even in the core of this definition is the notion of sustainability. When you look at being able to use heritage in a way that is good for today and tomorrow, that enables future generations also to enjoy heritage, to protect their heritage, etc. So on the right side of this slide, heritage may be tangible or intangible, or a combination of both. And they're usually inseparable because even most tangible heritage has some intangible elements with it. It includes living cultures, traditions and customs, languages, handicrafts, faith and family, art forms, folklore, and music, and the list could go on and on with regard to intangible heritage. Of course, tangible heritage is typically comprised of buildings, archaeological site, art, museums, industrial areas, transportation modes, cultural landscapes, battlefields, castles, temples, etc., etc. And Dr. Mayuk was very good at outlining some of those in his initial comments as well. So heritage tourism is basically the use of heritage assets and resources, tangible, living, and intangible, for touristic purposes, including education, cultural immersion, self-reflection and identity realization, pleasure and fun, community development, and many, many other different motivations and purposes. So once again, I think one thing I really want to emphasize in this presentation is the broadness and the holistic nature of heritage and heritage tourism. It is very encompassing, and as we'll see in a few slides, it also includes other types of heritage that other types of tourism that we often don't necessarily consider to be heritage, but it is heritage tourism. The market for heritage tourism, we can say, includes serious heritage tourists. These are people who are on one end of the spectrum, who are very serious. They seek cultural experiences, and they are those who travel specifically to visit heritage places or participate in cultural activities. They typically plan ahead, learn as much as possible, and are very prepared with knowledge about the place or the activity that they're visiting. And their demand and their experiences that they seek is often referred to as a niche tourism or special interest form of tourism. On the other end of the spectrum is what we would call casual heritage tourists, or those who don't necessarily prepare, or they may be what Bob McKercher calls incidental heritage tourists, or cultural tourists who engage with heritage on an ad hoc basis. Maybe they run into a museum and so they go in to enjoy the museum. They might be primarily engaged in mass tourism activities such as beach visitation or cruises, and cultural heritage then just plays a very small part of their vacation experience. And in this case, this particular form of manifestation of heritage tourism would generally be considered mass tourism. And by the way, I should say that the majority of heritage tourism, as it's been defined throughout history, has in fact been a form of mass tourism. And mass tourism often includes a very strong heritage and cultural element. So what are some current trends that help us understand a little bit better the heritage tourism? I believe, and based on many years of reading and examining and fieldwork and talking to people, I believe that heritage is probably the most consumed tourism asset in the world. If you go back to the original definition of what heritage is, it's whatever we inherit from the past and we value and use today. So this is extremely encompassing, extremely broad. And so almost every organized tour or vacation package and leisure travel includes some element of cultural heritage as part of the experience or part of the product. And then again, this could be music, it could be visiting a museum, it might be visiting an ethnic village. Any sort of these experiences are a heritage experience. Some estimates suggest that about 80% of all travel includes visits to places of cultural importance. And in many countries and regions, heritage is the most important tourism asset of all. And they're very well known for their heritage tourism. This is particularly the case with UNESCO World Heritage Sites, where they tend to get a lot more visibility on the global stage, as well as most World Heritage Sites are well known already because they exemplify some of those universal values. And we'll talk a little bit about in a few minutes about what I call the democratization of heritage, meaning taking heritage from the grand to the simple and trying to understand how we can empower communities in sustainable ways through being more encompassing in our definition and our views of heritage. And I already mentioned the last point, that heritage has long been an important part of mass tourism. Another interesting trend, which I mentioned a minute ago, is the idea that there are many other types of tourism that are also heritage tourism. And sometimes as researchers or marketers, we want to draw very clear lines between tourism types, which is really impossible and a little bit ridiculous actually to do, because there's so much overlap and so many different types and subtypes of tourism. For example, pilgrimage and religious tourism are a form of heritage tourism. If you look at what is involved in pilgrimage, faith, practices, prayers, travel, traditions, etc., that is all part of heritage. What we inherit and we use is very strongly manifested in religious tourism and pilgrimage. In fact, I would argue that pilgrimage and religious tourism is in fact one of the best examples and best manifestations of heritage tourism. But other types of tourism, such as agritourism, sport tourism, industrial tourism, archaeotourism or archaeological-based tourism, and volunteer tourism are also have very strong heritage elements and may in fact be considered forms of heritage tourism. If you look at the picture on the right, this is a group of volunteer tourists who have come to help with an archaeological dig. And so, for example, their experience is entirely heritage based on the history of a Native American site in this particular case. But they're volunteering, they're volunteer tourists, but they're completely immersed within a heritage and an archaeological experience. So what about the heritage and the principles of sustainability? How did those come into play together? There's been quite a bit of research in planning and managing heritage tourism, and I will equate this with cultural tourism. Some people don't like the fact that I say cultural tourism is essentially the same as heritage tourism, but it really is. If properly planned and managed, heritage tourism has the potential to empower communities socially, economically, politically, and psychologically. And so does every other form of tourism. But heritage and cultural tourism has a special way of being able to do this. For example, heritage tourism or tourism in general can be a very key way in transitioning economies from extractive and manufacturing industrial activities to what is known as post-Fordist, service-oriented economies in at least two ways. So heritage tourism can use traditional industry as an asset or as a resource in two ways. It may be a regenerative tool for declining industrial zones and other wastelands, stimulating entrepreneurial activity and attracting private and public investments. So we've seen many examples around the world where tourism can come in and sort of resurrect or re-help a declining economic region, particularly in mining and industrial areas, to become heritage areas. Heritage tourism can help alleviate high rates of unemployment caused by the dismantling of factories, mining, and other heavy industries, as well as declining farm incomes in rural areas. And this picture on the left here is from Myanmar, and an example of a very much a declining, a very impoverished rural region in Myanmar that is trying to develop tourism as a means of supplementing the meager farm income. So heritage and the principles of sustainability in general terms. So we talk a lot about pro-poor tourism, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals also really focus a lot on empowerment. They focus a lot on income, standard of living, pro-poor activities, for example. And heritage tourism has a really important role to play in developing these standards and in upholding these Sustainable Development Goals. For example, pro-poor heritage tourism can enable residents to participate better in the benefits of tourism. Well, this goes without saying, because our goal of all community-based tourism is that we want tourism to improve the quality of life and the well-being of destination residents, not just force them to bear the burdens of tourism. Traditionally, we know that people on the margins, I will call them marginal peoples, such as indigenous people or women or minority groups or even children or people with physical disabilities. These are the people who have traditionally had to bear the burdens of tourism most without reaping the rewards of tourism. And so any form of tourism that is pro-poor, that is sustainable or community-based will in fact meet these goals. But from a heritage perspective, it really helps communities to participate better because it is their heritage that is being sold. It is their heritage that is being consumed by tourism, and therefore they should then benefit more from their heritage. This is especially crucial because their heritage, and we know from many examples throughout history, that the heritage of indigenous people, the heritage of local people has often been exploited. It's often been misappropriated or appropriated for tourism purposes. And those people whose heritage it is have not benefited. We've just seen this recently in Tanzania with the Maasai people who have been pushed out of their traditional tribal lands just in the last 2 months by the Tanzanian government to make way for bigger spending tourism, game hunting, game preserve sorts of tourism. So rather than pushing the native people off of their lands, they should be embraced, and their indigenous knowledge should be included in the planning and management of heritage tourism. That's how we ensure more sustainable forms of tourism. And this idea of indigenous knowledge, who knows better about the environment, about culture, about the place, about the sense of place and the meaning of place than the people who are from that place, or the people whose ancestors developed that place. And yet tourism has this tendency to often, at least traditionally, it's improving now, often to relegate those people, we call them descendant communities, communities that have descended from their ancestors who developed the landscapes that we enjoy as tourists. Tourism shouldn't be pushing them away, it should be embracing them. And their knowledge about the history and culture of the place, those are very basic sustainability principles that carefully planned and well executed heritage tourism can help sustain those principles. Such as this village, these villagers in Fiji, for example, have been empowered through tourism economically, socially, especially these women who traditionally didn't have a lot of socioeconomic status, but now do have more so because of heritage tourism. Heritage tourism can help empower communities in decision-making. In many places today, particularly in the global South, decisions are still made from the outside, from government leaders in the capital cities rather than the grassroots community level. And then the government or developers come in and say, okay, we're going to impose this form of tourism on you, or we're going to create this new attraction, or we're going to create an ethnic village and we want you to act in this ethnic village. So heritage, the principles of heritage, which are basically underlaid with sustainability, can help empower communities in the decision-making process. The decisions to share or not share cultural heritage should come from the community itself, whose heritage it is, not from outside interests. Heritage tourism can provide opportunities for residents to help preserve their cultural traditions and their built environment, their homes, their living traditions, their cultural landscapes, and things like this, because it helps them realize the value of these things. And I'll talk in a few slides a little bit about different cultural perspectives on heritage and heritagization. Not every culture values its heritage as something important. And this is, I've seen this in many different parts of the world where communities such as this small village in Bhutan here, where we interviewed a lot of people there, and they don't see their lifestyle, they don't see their architecture and their traditions as having any sort of social or economic or cultural value. In their mind, it's just the way we are. It's just our life. Nobody's interested in us. So this sort of empowering communities can help them see that they have value and that their heritage is worth protecting. Tourism has the opportunity to do that, to highlight that. This can then build regional identities, community solidarity, and collective values in the process. And these are very, very important principles underlying the Sustainable Development Goals. Because if communities feel united, if they feel a sense of solidarity, a sense of identity in relation to place, then they're more inclined to protect the heritage. Then they're more inclined to value their heritage. And I don't mean value their heritage in an exploitative way, but in a way that will help them appreciate it and want to protect it, but also gain from it economically if they're able to. So heritage tourism can enable communities to decide what heritage they should share with outsiders and what elements of their heritage they might want to keep hidden. And there are many examples. There's some great Native American tribes, one here in Arizona, for example, the Hopi tribe, and they're very empowered, extremely empowered, and they have been empowered for a couple of hundred years. And they have chosen to really be very careful in selecting what elements of their cultural heritage they want to share with outsiders. And this idea of heritage democratization or democratization is something that I've been working on the last 10 years or so, looking at how mass tourism, or in other words, traditional heritage tourism, has in the past, it's really focused on the most opulent, the grandest, the biggest, and the most famous heritage places. But yet, if we look at, for example, this is the Royal Palace in Copenhagen, Denmark, one of the homes of the Queen and her family. This is what we typically think of heritage. We think of heritage as being these very grand, opulent, fabulous places like this, with, quote, universal value. But in heritagizing these sorts of grand places, we're disinheriting simultaneously the small places, the ordinary places. And if we think about how people, 80 to 100 billion people, however many people have ever lived on the earth, if we ask the question, how many of those people who have lived on the earth were kings and queens, right? And rulers and popes and great generals? Very few. But yet the majority of the heritage that we consume in tourism, or that tourism consumes, is this kind of heritage, the grandest. But what about the ordinary heritage? Okay. Traditional global scale heritage that is tangible, ancient, and grand. So this raises the questions. What about heritage that is ordinary, new heritage, or intangible heritage? Okay. They're important too. And they're very important to protect, and they may also have economic value through tourism. By recognizing that heritage is all around us, not just in castles, cathedrals, and temples, communities can become empowered to appreciate their own heritage, and they can benefit from tourism economically, socially, and politically. So this is manifest in very specific niches in cultural tourism, such as those mentioned earlier, like agritourism, food tourism. As Dr. Mayuk mentioned at the beginning, food is a very important part of heritage. And so even culinary tourism or food tourism, it is a form of heritage tourism. And it is really some of the work that I've done on food heritage food is one of the very best manifestations of heritage. And so it tells a lot of stories, and we're not going to go into that because we don't have a lot of time, but it definitely is an important part of the heritage landscape of places. And scale is also important. Local heritage, personal heritage, community heritage versus national and global heritage. So the scale of heritage also has major implications for sustainability, because again, very often local heritage is ignored in conservation, in selling for tourism, etc., almost always in favor of national and global heritage. Some examples, very typical examples. This is called Teotihuacan outside of Mexico City, a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a very famous attraction. Obviously, the Forbidden City in Beijing. We all recognize the Taj Mahal. The St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican City. This is a castle in Luxembourg. And this is a museum, and it's a college now on the island of Barbados, which has a very long history of slavery. So the white man's house and the mansion house has been well protected. But if you go behind this, this is where the slaves lived, and this is what the slave heritage looks like. So it is not well protected. It's not interpreted, it's not preserved, it's not sold as a tourism product. Only the white slave owner's home is sold as a tourism product. That is not balanced, it is not fair, it is not equitable. And in so doing, by aggrandizing or heritagizing this becomes disinherited. The history of the slaves becomes disinherited. A rural landscape again in Myanmar. And I would ask this question, this Blue Mosque, why is this more important? And this is a big tourist attraction, right, in Turkey. Why is this more important than, say, this? This is also a small masjid that is very important for the camel herders. This is in the UAE. Why is it that tourism values this but not this? Why is it that conservation values this but not this? So we have to ask these questions. And is it sustainable to ignore the small, ordinary heritage in favor of the grand, extraordinary heritage? So I know I'm almost out of time, so I'll just take a few more minutes and finalize this. Not all cultures or peoples view heritage in the same way. And this is something I've been working on lately as well. Even the language can determine. Certain languages, for example, in the Nepali language, heritage means inheriting wealth or grand things. And so ordinary people and ordinary heritage would not be considered heritage in most cases in languages like that. In Western, we have a Western bias, and in the Western world, we want to see more things protected and more things viewed as heritage. But in the traditional world, in the global South, people generally do not see their simple heritage as being important, even though it really is. Not all people are empowered to share their cultures. And some people will never be convinced about what heritage is or what heritage value can be valued. And again, culture, that last point there, cultural differences might also contribute to the destruction of important heritage, such as the Chinese Revolution, where from the 60s to the 80s, basically, the old was destroyed in favor of the new. And so these sorts of, we see this not just in China, but in a lot of other places where old is considered derogatory, it's considered negative, it's considered backward, and new is considered progress. And so this, again, reflects in empowering communities, it reflects in conservation in many different ways, and how heritage is preserved and sold. Just one last example here. In Luoyang, China, in 2016, I was walking in the old town with a couple of professors, and I saw this small shop here. And I said, wow, I really like this shop. It's very fascinating. And what an important piece of Luoyang's heritage. And the Chinese professor I was with turned to me and said, that's not heritage. It's too simple. So there's this concept, again, in many people's cultures that heritage must be great. It must be tangible. It must be something momentous. It can't be something that's just ordinary life. And so I think we should try as researchers to broaden our view of what heritage is. Because if ordinary heritage is lost, it can't come back. It won't grow back. If all we do is focus on the extraordinary heritage, then we ignore and disinherit the ordinary heritage. So in conclusion, heritage is everywhere around us. When we visit cultural places, we eat, and this is in our everyday life. When we go for Friday prayers at the mosque, that is heritage. When we eat, we go out to eat and we have national foods, that is heritage. When we celebrate birthdays and holidays, that is heritage. We are in our daily lives and when we travel, all participating in the very act of heritage consumption. So we have the choice as consumers and producers of heritage experiences, whether we make that sustainable or not, and whether we support, as the pictures and the Sustainable Development Goals on this page mention. Heritage is not only about big and marvelous historic sites. Everyday ordinary landscapes and places are also important, but not every culture acknowledges heritage this way. Like I said, in most traditional societies in the Global South, heritage represents something extraordinary and large, not the simpler elements and everyday ways of life. However, if properly planned and managed, heritage tourism can give a voice to the voiceless, build solidarity and a collective identity, reinvigorate derelict landscapes and declining economies, and empower communities socially, economically, politically, and psychologically, thereby supporting many of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, especially those related to poverty reduction, economic growth, gender equality, well-being, justice, and responsible actions. So that is the end of my presentation. I think I've stayed pretty much in time now. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with everyone at Taylor's University and to present some thoughts on cultural heritage.
Thanks a lot, Professor. It was a really interesting talk. We'll do a summary of the talk later on. I have been getting quite a few questions sent to me, which I will also ask you at the end of Dr. Ray's talk. And I would also like to remind all the members here, nearly 200 members here, to keep posting your questions in the link which has been provided in the group chat. And I will try and address as many questions as possible by the end of the next speech. Okay, so let me go to our next speaker. The next speaker which we have today is my dear friend, Dr. Raymond Rastegar. Dr. Raymond is a Master's of Environmental Sciences and holds a PhD in Tourism Management and is a lecturer and researcher in tourism at the UQ Business School, University of Queensland, Australia. His research focuses on sustainable tourism development in developing countries with specific interest in local community livelihood, participation, empowerment, and environmental conservation. His recent research projects have investigated the impacts of tourism at local level and delivered new insights into the tourism phenomenon to advocate a more just and sustainable tourism future for humans and non-humans. Dr. Ray was also awarded the Fellow of Higher Education Academy in 2019. He will be talking to you on the topic, Weaving Notions of Justice into Heritage Tourism. Without taking much time, Dr. Ray, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Mayuk. Thank you so much for the introduction. I should say good afternoon from the Sunshine State here in Australia. We have a beautiful sunny but a little bit windy day here. I would like to use this opportunity to first thank the organizing committee for this summer school. Being part of the team in the last few months, I know how much time, efforts, and even number of people who have been involved in organizing this great program. So I would like to thank you, Dr. Mustafa, Dr. Mayuk, Dr. Shantini, Dr. Rupani, and many other people who have been involved in this program. That's a great job. Excuse me. I'm also honored to be here today speaking about heritage tourism with people like Professor Dallen Timothy. We all know the contribution Dallen had to the field of tourism, especially in the area of heritage tourism. So when I was thinking about preparing my own presentation and talk, I thought if you are going to have Dallen and Gianna, who couldn't be here with us today, unfortunately, it's really smart to stay away from heritage tourism. Excuse me. So my talk today will be more about asking questions that I may not necessarily have answer for, but hopefully it will start this arguments, conversation, and critical thinking to see what's happening around us, especially when we are discussing heritage tourism, and most importantly, sustainable development goals. So I would like to start my talk by asking this question: what's the reason we are all considering, or what's the importance of sustainable development goals? When we are thinking about any type of development, it's either tourism or even outside tourism, we see how these people are considering, or how even sustainable development goals are influencing this type of developments all around the world. I remember when I was doing my PhD study back then, we were talking about Millennium Development Goals. We had 8 goals. And it was very interesting because those goals were focusing more on developing countries. And when I was reading some of these documents back then for my own study, my interpretation was that these goals were talking about a different world, different planet. It was that there was like a global south and global north, or developing countries or developed countries. And we had this solution in advanced countries, and we wanted to fix everything in other parts of the world. However, I'm really happy to see that those goals now led to development, or considering these sustainable development goals, which are broader. And when we are thinking or considering any of these goals, for example, thinking about Goal 7, which is addressing the energy poverty, it's more about what's happening in, for example, European countries. We have many of this research concerned, for example, in Germany, about energy poverty or energy transition. When we are thinking about Goal 13, climate change, it's affecting everyone. So it's about identifying this interdependency and equal vulnerability of everyone. It doesn't matter if you are living in global south or global north. But it's also interesting to see what's the role of tourism, because the reason I know we have got something around more than 1,400 people attending this summer school from more than 80 countries. Definitely, we are interested to know about sustainable development goals, but we are also interested, we are doing research, we are studying, we are interested in tourism. So what's the role tourism playing here? If you go to this website, like organization like UNWTO, they are all talking about what role, positive role, tourism can play in achieving sustainable development goals. It might be about promoting peace, it might be about environmental conservation, it might be about sustainable form of development. So it's like tourism is used as a tool, or promoted as a tool to achieve sustainable development goals, which looks very good, beautiful. But the thing is, to better understand this link between tourism and sustainable development goals, we need to have this critical thinking to see what's exactly happening in the real world outside our research. Here I'm going to use 2 examples. We know how climate change is affecting everyone. It doesn't matter where you are living, it's affecting you. It might be, for example, me living here in Australia. In last 10 years, we experienced different floods, cyclones, storms, and bushfire, heat waves, or you may live in Middle East, in United States. Somehow we are all experiencing or affected by climate change. And it's becoming a very serious threat. When it comes to World Heritage Sites, or as Dallen beautifully explained, all these properties, we now have more than 1,000 properties all around the world. They are all heritage sites. So it's really important to see how it's affecting this heritage site. We just recently had this flood happening in Middle East. And it was really sad to see how these, old building heritage were destroyed by flood, because, they were situated in locations that the area barely receive a few millimeters of rain per year. So they withstand these buildings. They were built to withstand this harsh and dry and very hot climate, not too much rain or flood. And similarly, we see what's happening in Taj Mahal, India, acid rain, how it's changing the color of these marbles. We see how sea level rise in Bangladesh affecting this Bagrat district, how these buildings are soaking this salt and this water, and after the water is evaporated, we see how this salt is forming coat around these buildings and damaging these heritage sites. So there are all these sites, buildings, properties all around the world are affected by this, by the impacts of climate change. So when we are looking at goal 13, we see the importance of this goal and how this goal is referring to a crisis that we are facing that affecting all of us. And in the case of, in the interest of this, session, heritage, buildings and properties. However, it gets complicated when we are thinking about the role of tourism or what it has promised. We know tourism itself is a contributor to climate change. There are many studies showing how tourism is contributing to climate change. So here we have tourism that's promoted as a tool to achieve sustainable development goals. And other side, we have tourism contributing to crises such as climate change that's affecting these properties. So it needs careful thinking. We know we had this arguments going on for around adaptation actions, mitigation actions that are happening. But even when it comes to these actions, even in the more developed nations, I recently read these studies about, for example, in the United States, how these mitigation and adaptation actions are in favor of, for example, beach and urban tourism, and not those people who are affected living in low-lying, for example, areas. We can see similar examples in, for example, developing countries. So it again needs this careful thinking, even when, for example, we are thinking, we had this meeting happened in Scotland last year, speaking about, this transition to net zero transition by 2050. But we have to start asking these questions. How many of these, nations, countries, especially in global South, are ready to go through this process? Do they have enough knowledge? How they can, do this? So there are many questions we have to ask around, these arguments. Similarly, here we see we have this, marine heritage site. This started in 1981 by Great Barrier Reef in Australia, and then it expanded to more than 50 sites all around the world, in Europe, in America, in many, many other countries. And it's really sad that we see the research by UNESCO shows that almost all these sites will disappear by the end of the century because of the climate change. And it's more interesting and again sad to know almost more than 70% of these sites do not know how climate change is affecting this, this marine heritage sites. And they do not have the knowledge to, reduce the impacts. There was a study here in the last few years. It was for it was going on for 4 years in Australia. There were a group of researchers looking at this particular fish in Great Barrier Reef, living in coral reefs. They were investigating how change in temperature of the water is affecting this fish, breeding, and everything that's happening to this fish. It's wonderful, it's fascinating. You imagine how much knowledge this research can generate. There are many other, similar research happening here, for example, in Australia. But my question is, how much of this knowledge is transferred to other, places? When we are speaking about 70%, more than 70% of these sites all around the world do not have enough knowledge, do not have enough resources, or they do not know how to manage their heritage. Then the question is, so why we are not transferring this knowledge? What's the problem here? Why it's not happening? So again, these are all the questions we need to ask around, when we are thinking about, our heritage, sustainable development or achieving these SDGs. And here again, we can see this beautiful goal that's referring to the same problem, conserving and sustainable use of marine resources. I really like the idea here that's being promoted by many of these nations, the idea of blue economy. Blue economy is the term that's used, and it's about the industries like tourism, fishery, and marine transport. Many of these activities that are that's promised to bring this or it's like a form of sustainable development in many of these regions that's providing benefits to the community, to heritage, to our natural resources, and many other benefits. But when we think carefully about tourism, that's considered as one of these sustainable activities, we see the same sites under pressure from similar activities like tourism. It happens here in Great Barrier Reefs. It happens in small developing states. It's happening in many other places. I do not want to say we are not doing very well. There are some sustainable form of tourism development, but we can also see many other issues around these activities. And even we had this problem here in Australia, even though we have all this research, we have the resources, but still it's not a sustainable tourism. And we know how it's affecting Great Barrier Reef and other resources here. And again, to me, it seems that we have a problem. We are creating a solution, and this solution itself becomes another problem. And then we have to, create another term or another solution. So we are starting by, this blue economy, and blue economy becomes the problem. So we are thinking about blue justice. And now there are many researchers who are, working on this term of blue justice and how we have to minimize the negative impacts of blue economy and all these activities. Here, I really like the idea Michael Hall presented in 2 days ago in his talk, thinking about one of the reasons we have all these research papers and increasing number of journal articles is because we are just creating new term. We are creating new form of tourism. It doesn't mean that you're answering the question or providing solution. It's like more of the problem remains, but you're just jumping from one, to another solution, and then to another solution without answering the question. So saying that, I would like to come back to this discussion around the World Heritage Site. And we know we have all these beautiful heritage sites, and we have this culture. It's about the living culture of these people living all around the world. And it's really good to see the recognition, especially when they are being inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's a complicated process. They have to go through nomination, preparing the document, and then after a few years, hopefully being inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. When you're looking at many of these documents, nomination documents, you see they are focusing on the local community, the custodian. Because they say it's their culture, it has to firstly benefit this community, or as beautifully Dallen explained, it has to involve these people. If they say yes, they have to go ahead. If they disagree, it shouldn't happen when we are talking about tourism. So it's really, when we are thinking about this process, it promises a very sustainable form of tourism development. Here, I want to provide a couple of examples of the research we did. We went to one of these heritage sites in central Iran, the city of Yazd, which was inscribed as a World Heritage City in 2017. We did this study 2 years after the inscription, after of all those excitement. We went and talked to these people, local people, different people living in different parts of the city, to see how's their feeling, what's their attitude and perceptions of going through this process, being inscribed as a World Heritage City. Of course, many people were very proud, they were happy to see this happening. They really liked the recognition of their culture. They really liked to see the increasing number of tourists by like almost 200%. Many people were benefiting from the, from even, money that were coming to the community. But when we talked to other people who were not involved in tourism or who were not receiving benefits from this, activity, there were people who were talking about the real impacts. we could identify many social issues around this, development process. There were people who negatively affected by like increasing like traffic pollution, noise, or it was really interesting. We talked to some of these people who used to live in the old part of the city, which was of course much cheaper to live before inscription. And there were these people belong to working class immigrants, from other cities and even other countries. So it was much cheaper to live in that area. But after inscription, many of these buildings were bought, purchased by other people and converted to these traditional restaurants, traditional accommodations, and it was getting more and more expensive to live in this old part of the city. So many of these people had to move out, not in other area in the city because it was too expensive for them. They had to move to villages nearby, to live in villages and then work in the city. So they were people who were being affected by this, development. And then we had people who have never been informed or involved in decision making. They had no idea. Again, I want to refer to the discussion by Dallen. They knew what happened, but they didn't play any role in decision making. It was happening. So even it was like either this or nothing. So they had no voice in this development process. So again, it's providing examples, of this, heritage tourism and what's happening around us. Here, I want to use a point to provide another example. When you are thinking about tourism development especially in developing countries, it's extremely difficult to speak about a particular sector or type of tourism development. I heard about this very interesting study in India that this group of tourists were interviewed before and after visiting the country. And this researcher divided these people to two groups. First, the group who were really interested to go and see local culture, temples, even slum area, and culture of this country, India. And there were a second group who were really interested to go and visit places like Jim Court National Park, like Tiger, like this Kerala, these natural attractions, the environment of the country. And the same group of people were interviewed after their visit. And it was really fascinating to see how people who were interested in the culture were talking about how much they enjoy visiting natural environment. And people who were interested in natural environment were speaking about how much they enjoyed visiting this temple, local people, local village, and food, local food. So it's extremely difficult to say these people are only visiting this heritage site, because especially in developing countries, visiting this temple that's situated in national park, it's about local culture, their food, living culture, environment, everything is connected. So it's considering that points bring us to this this fact that there are many, even though when we are speaking about heritage tourism, there are many stakeholders involved in this process. And we did another study in one of these villages. We identified three key stakeholders: Department of Tourism, who were responsible for tourism development in the area. There was a village situated in a national park, which has a very strong and unique, heritage and culture. And then we had Department of Environment, who was responsible for environmental conservation in the area. And we had local community as a custodian and the people whose culture and heritage were used for tourism development. It was very early stages of tourism development. And it was really interesting to see how these people were talking about different goals, different lack of collaborations, and different ideas they had about tourism. For example, people in Department of Tourism were excited to develop tourism, use this heritage culture as a like an asset for tourism development, brings the money to the community. And then we had Department of Environment, who were against 100% against tourism development, not tourism in general. They did not like the type of tourism development that were happening because they thought it's a threat to the fragile environment. And then we had local community who were not involved in decision making and benefit, receiving benefit from this activity. So they have been just informed, yes, this is happening. They could see the changes. They could see, for example, how Department of Tourism is making decisions. So when we are thinking about these problems, you may see it's happening in many places, and it's probably very small village, and tourism has both positive and negative impacts. But here I want to zoom out. I want to go to the global level. We see again the same stakeholders are playing a role. We see these people, in favor of environment. People are thinking about, tourism development, again, local community. I remember I presented this idea a few years ago in a conference here in Australia, that how this idea of the half-earth proposal that's proposed by this environmentalist is going to affect tourism. And I can see how it's gaining popularity over, last few years. So these people are thinking, and to be honest, when you are listening to them, it's very convincing. Their argument is very convincing that to conserve our resources, we have to allocate at least 50% of the land on planet Earth to conservation. That's the solution. That's probably the only solution. So I want us to think, if it happens, just imagine if it's happening. I can see how it's again gaining popularity over the last few years. Considering contemporary tourism, with all the impacts we see, which side is tourism is going to be? Is it on the green side or dark side? What will happen to all these tourism activities? How it's going to affect this, tourism marketing? We know we are coming out of this pandemic. Marketing people are extremely happy that we are receiving more and more tourists, and there are many planes are flying now. We are seeing increasing, in negative impacts of tourism. So again, in a few years, where we are going to be, which side we are going to be, how it's going to affect tourism. So considering this, there is no doubt, again, I want to go back to the argument I started my talk with. There is no doubt that tourism has the power to promote peace, to conserve our resources, our heritage, and there are many opportunities here. But if you want to be honest, if we look in the real world, in our practice, we haven't been that successful. If you go back 10, 20 years, look at these research papers that you can read, we had the solution. We knew we had the knowledge, but it not necessarily transferred or been implemented in the real. We are still talking about the same problems maybe we had, a few years ago. So when we are thinking about, this innovation, which is the theme for this, summer school, innovation is not necessarily always about the technology. Innovation is about new way of thinking, about changing our practices, about tourism in the real world. So if we want to go through this process of transition which we are talking all about, especially by 2015, we need to change anything. We have to change our practice. We have to change the way we are thinking about tourism. I really like this idea of technology. I'm not against technology. It can, benefit many of us. We can see the, positive impacts. But I'm asking this question: if I'm driving this car, Tesla car, which I'm very proud of, that's reducing my carbon footprint and emission because the electric car, am I going to ask myself these questions? How this, technology or the car I am driving affecting those mining communities in Africa? How many problems it's creating? We see armed conflicts, we see child abuse, we see everything that's happening in these mining communities that's providing this material for these electric cars in African communities. So it's like we are not solving the problem. We are moving, we are just changing from one topic to another topic. We are solving one, then creating another problem. So again, it needs a very critical thinking, and just sometimes I think we have to go even outside tourism. We have to see what's happening elsewhere in other fields, because again, it's about our interdependence. It's not only about thinking and promoting tourism. It's about what other stakeholders, environmental conservation, groups, and many other people are promoting, what's their thinking, how we can have this collaboration to think about more sustainable future. It's really sad that we do not have Gianna today, because I'm sure she was going to, have this talk about, future thinking and, having this, scenario planning. I just want to emphasize, when we are thinking about sustainable development, we can't just select one goal and say we are going to achieve this goal. We have to think about all these 17 goals. We have to think how our future thinking is taking us beyond sustainability, because sometimes I think this sustainable tourism, the term carries too much weight. It says something that it can't promise. It's not only using the term sustainable tourism in our document and then in the practice we do something else. So again, we have to think carefully how our action is leading us into more sustainable and just future. I just want to finish with this slide. I know it's probably longer than what I should talk for. What I presented today is a kind of summary of the paper I recently published, and it's really interesting that I should tell you. I was inspired to write this paper after the talk I gave in the summer school, the same summer school last year, and the conversation we had. It inspired me to write this paper. So I do not know, maybe this talk again inspired me to write another paper, in a few months. And lastly, we have this special issue that's coming out later this year. And we have collection of 16 papers that are looking at sustainable development, and they are using a justice lens, but again, different perspective around sustainable development goals. So if you're interested, most of these papers are now available online and you can read them. So again, thank you so much for this opportunity, and sorry for the long talk, and back to you, Dr. Mayuk.
Thank you, Dr. Raymond. Very interesting talk on justice and heritage tourism and the connect between them. We've got lots of questions coming in. I will ask all the participants to keep posting your questions on this Slido page, which is displayed at the moment. Or you can also scan this QR code with your mobile phones. Just take your phone, scan the thing. It'll open up into a web page, and then you can ask your questions there. So to both our speakers, I will start posting some questions which I've received. Let's go to the first one. Prof. Dallen, this question is for you. When does cultural tourism sites get converted into heritage tourism sites? There's a very, you use the word interchangeably, cultural and heritage tourism. But the question is, when does the cultural tourism site, let's say, I go to a temple in India, how does that suddenly become, let's say the temple is just made last year, it's a brand new temple. So it's a cultural heritage, but how does that convert into a heritage tourism site? Is there a time frame after which we can term a site as a heritage tourism site?
I saw that question. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I saw that question and I was a little bit confused, but I think I have an answer. And the answer is that there is no time frame, because there's really no difference. And this is kind of what I was trying to say, is that we often think about heritage as being old, and heritage does not have to be old. Heritage can be from 3 months ago. It can be from 1 year ago. It can be from 5,000 years ago. Heritage is something from the past. And so it depends on how it's valued and how it's valued by the consumers as well as the producers. So it's kind of a difficult question to answer, other than to say they're simultaneous, because culture is heritage and heritage is culture. And so we really can't draw a line between them. And age doesn't really have anything to do with whether or not something is valued as heritage.
Fantastic. I completely agree with you. And especially because I'm a food and tourism researcher, so I always go back to my food examples. If I cook something from my cultural heritage, I call it cultural heritage. It's together. If I cook something in my kitchen, it is my culture, but it is also my heritage, because that connects me, even if I'm in Malaysia, but I'm an Indian. my food, what's cooked in my kitchen right now, connects me to my heritage. That's where I come from, and that's what I am.
Right. Yeah, and often it's also, by the way, we often don't, and I've written about personal heritage. Every single person in the world has some personal heritage. And in many cases, that goes back to the concept of scale that I mentioned. Sometimes our personal heritage happens to be national heritage also, but personal heritage also causes us to behave in a certain way. It also causes us to travel to specific destinations and participate in specific activities.
Fantastic, sir. I'll have another question for you. How do you balance the dilemma between remaining authentic by having authenticity in cultural heritage over framing heritage to the past and rejecting innovation?
Is there I was trying to look for that. Is that on the list here? I want to read it as I'm
I think it's one of the second one
second.
from the top,
Okay.
or the third one from the top.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question too. And technology space is something that we all are dealing with. I am not a technology person myself, but I'm interested in how heritage is adapting, heritage consumption and production is adapting to technology spaces. And I think technology has a lot of potential to help further the cause of heritage tourism, help protect heritage, and also to help sustain or uphold the principles of sustainability, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's GIS and GPS technology. All of these sorts of things have a lot to do with heritage management. I know that there's a lot of really interesting heritage research going on in Europe, particularly in Spain right now, using drones and artificial intelligence to try to understand heritage tourist behaviors. And so I think it fits very, very well together when we're talking about history, heritage, which is from the past, and we're using very present-oriented technologies to understand or to communicate the past. I think it's a little bit of a marriage made in heaven in a lot of ways, in the way heritage sites have been able to use technology to interpret, to tell the story, and to protect the past, I think is very interesting. And the other part of that deals with contemporary tourism dynamics. We know that the marketplace is changing rapidly, how people are becoming more sophisticated in their travel experiences. People are starting to be more interested in very specific niche experiences rather than mass experiences for the most part, although those will always exist. And I think that that's where scale comes into important role to play. And if the communities are empowered with their own local heritage, I know one of the questions also asks about the global versus the local. And if communities are empowered to share their heritage and to protect their heritage and to value their heritage, I think more tourism niches can be created, and that can sort of dissipate some of the negative impacts on the mass tourism sites. If you know what I mean, it sort of spreads out the impacts. It can create impacts in other areas. I don't see that has, oh, I see the one, then there's the one about authenticity. Is that, I remember you mentioned authenticity. There's a lot of questions, and I don't want to take up too much time, I apologize, regarding authenticity. One of the biggest buzzwords, the research words in heritage studies is authenticity, and that is a very subjective concept. Some person may have a very authentic experience, while a different person at the same location might not have an authentic experience. And so authenticity is a very subjective notion and means different things to different people. But authenticity, what does that really mean? And we don't know yet. We still don't know after many years of debating it. What about a heritage place or a heritage experience makes it authentic versus innovation? And how does innovation and technology take away from the authenticity of place? Honestly, I think that this is a really good research question that would make a great dissertation, a PhD thesis, for example, because it's definitely something we're not sure about. there's definitely pros and cons to both of those perspectives. Did Dr. Mayuk disappear?
Yeah, Dr. Mayuk has a technical issue, so he's coming back soon.
Oh, good, because we miss him already.
Yeah, but I think he will be here soon.
Okay.
So
there won't be any question for me. That's good.
yeah, I think Dr. Mayuk has a few questions, so
Okay.
he will ask you the question. Waiting for him. Yeah, he's already here. Sorry, using technology and online seminar, sometimes this issue happen.
You can never trust technology.
We have no choice. We have to trust, but we also need to consider limitations
Yes.
and some issues that sometimes happen. Yeah, Dr. Mayuk is here. Okay, continue, Dr. Mayuk.
Technology always gives you this, especially when you are in a very important or very busy situation. Sorry, I couldn't. I had to leave in between. The electricity in my house suddenly went off, and this never happened before. All right, let's get back to the questions. Dr. Ray, maybe you can answer this. How and why would decision-making bodies empower local communities to make decisions regarding heritage sites? What is in it for them? You know, we always talk about, Dr. Dallen was talking about heritage sites and local communities being empowered and being being allowed into the decision-making process. But why would the governments do that? What is in it for them?
That's a good question, and I believe that you have to ask government to this question. They have probably the best answer. However, it's to me it seems very complicated because being involved in this research, particularly in developing countries, in Middle East, in India, and other countries, I can see how not government itself, the government organizations in these countries are more powerful stakeholders. And they usually have the power to make the decision, and they are not actually involving people, they are informing community about what's happening, what's going to happen. So it's again about changing the mindset, changing, probably recognizing, because even when we are talking about justice, we are talking about different dimensions. One is recognizing the rights of local people, recognizing in this case their heritage, they are custodians. So if we give them this power to make the decision to say yes or no, and the other thing is because we can see that here, even in Australia, more developed countries, these are the people who have the knowledge, who know about the environment, who know about the heritage. They have this, knowledge that needs to be used. They need to be involved from very, very early stages. Of course, we need, especially in the developing countries, we need government interventions, we need this funding, we need these supports to come. But it should happen in more sustainable. But I do not have a clear answer to say this is the strategy and we should do this in all countries. That's not going to happen. We have all these different settings and they need their own strategies. And people who are living in that place, different stakeholders, they are the best people to make these decisions. Even though we are speaking about this global agenda, sustainable development goals, which are set at the global level, but when they are going to this local level, so we need to see some changes. We need to leave it to these local authorities and all these stakeholders to see what's probably the best way to implement these goals. So that's the best answer I can have for this question.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. Same question, Dr. Dallen. What is in it for the government? Why should they do it? And I'll follow up with another question. That how can we as researchers fight against this developmentalism and capitalism embraced by government or politicians?
Yeah, thank you. Good question. And I think Dr. Raymond really addressed it well. I think from a heritage perspective, heritage sells very well. And the key word that came up a minute ago also was this idea of authenticity, and authenticity seems to sell well, often at the expense of indigenous people, for example, which Raymond was talking about the human rights and justice issues. And tourism traditionally has not been a very caring and justice-oriented sector. It's been profiteering and pure capitalism. And that's okay to a degree, but as long as the people are empowered to really, I did my PhD research in Indonesia many, many years ago, and the focus of that was looking at community-based planning and development. And if the community owns tourism, if they take the ownership of their development efforts, then they can't blame anyone else for its failures. But they can also see how they can also reflect on how it benefits them because of the decisions that they have made and the policies that they've created. What is in it for the government? The government basically is in it for income creation, obviously. And often, all too often, the rights of the indigenous people and the local people, and it's not always indigenous people, but local people are often trampled in the national government's quest to increase jobs, increase tax revenue, etc. And so it's extremely important that I think in all forms of tourism, but particularly with relation to cultural heritage, that communities have to be empowered. Otherwise, their heritage changes. Otherwise, their heritage is bastardized. It's morphized. It changes who they are, and that can psychologically and socially disempower people. And but the empowerment of communities empowers them politically as well. And a lot of governments don't want that, unfortunately. A lot of governments want to keep people in their control, in their power. And empowering communities really scares a lot of governments because they will potentially lose control. And I know there are many examples, particularly historically. Like I said, things have been improving the last 25 or 30 years, but historically, it has been the governments that have appropriated local cultures, for example, for tourism. Particularly,
I'd like to follow up here.
Yeah.
How do we as researchers, or can we as researchers address this issue?
I think
or
so.
Highlight this issue in some way?
I think so. I think we need to look at it from, as Raymond's research has been doing for years, looking at it from a justice perspective and saying, look, human rights, justice, ownership, cultural property rights, these are all issues that belong in a discussion about cultural heritage. And in the global South, this is particularly relevant. What can we as researchers do to try to encourage the voice of the people? And I don't mean in a revolutionary way. I just mean simply empowering people so that women and minorities and ethnic groups and children and other marginal peoples can be empowered in ways that the Sustainable Development Goals emphasize. And really, like I mentioned at the outset, I really believe cultural heritage-based tourism is one of the best forms of tourism that can do that, because heritage is part of the community. It is an integral part of who people are and their identity. And if the government comes in and takes that away from them, then it continues to disempower them. They continue to lose their identity. So as researchers, I think we have a responsibility, in fact, to elevate the voice of the people, whether it's through community grounded research, whether it's through town hall meetings, whether it's through effecting policies and practices that give the grassroots organizations more voice.
Thank you, Prof. That was a nice answer. In the interest of time, I think we'll ask two more questions, one to each speaker. I'll go to Dr. Raymond here. Dr. Raymond, the consumption of culture and heritage normally requires immersion into the lives of the locals, usually. How do you think the pandemic has affected the experience process? I had to put a pandemic question here.
Definitely. It reminds me of the discussion we had about technology, because I just love this technology. This is the theme of this, summer school. We had all this argument and discussion happening before the pandemic about the role technology can play in tourism, particularly this heritage tourism, visiting museums, these local communities. And by the time we had this pandemic, early 2020, I remember even we had this webinar talking about this tour guides who started, taking people from, the window of their, this camera, had this, virtual tours showing this, local communities food. It was okay, people could enjoy, sitting at home, but gradually we realized that's not what people want. They want the real experience. People were not satisfied. They had to do that. And that's the reason we see this, like people are just hungry to go back and see all those places after the pandemic. And definitely, even when we are thinking as a researcher about, anthropology and our research, methods, when we want to investigate the culture, it's not about only doing the survey or interviews. It's about living with those communities to be able to realize and feel and understand their culture. So I completely agree with you that we definitely need to immerse ourselves. And again, I want to say that might be even one of the reasons that programs like homestay programs, small scale, tourism development, they are gaining popularity. People are more interested to go and see these, rural communities, their way of life, backstage, not the front stage, or the stage authenticity, the discussion we had in the session yesterday. So they want to see that real culture, and it's about the culture and heritage, and so yeah, that's my answer to this question.
Okay, my internet is giving me trouble again. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. Yeah, I agree with what you said. And I have one of my master's student. She's doing a research on VR and AR technologies and how they can, whether these, we are doing a qualitative research. So whether these technologies can actually help in the tourism experience, especially for disabled people who cannot travel to such destinations. And again, being a qualitative researcher, I want to keep I express my biases, I be very reflexive in the way I explain things to the student, but I don't see VR and AR technology. I personally, as if I was a respondent to her, I don't see VR and AR technology replacing the tourist experience, the tourism experience. It can enhance maybe, but not the physical experience of visiting a place, feeling the sights, sounds, colors of the place. So, I'll do one more question to Prof. Dallen. Prof, how do you see the future of heritage tourism in view of changing technology space and the contemporary tourism dynamics?
I think I answered that one already earlier, but do you want me to address it again?
So, I mean, maybe on the tourism dynamics part.
Okay, well, I'll expand that a little bit then. So the tourist dynamics, we know they're changing. Different markets are being created. Different people have different interests, more sophisticated interests, and we're starting to see, particularly from a Western perspective, that people are dissatisfied with traditional mass tourism experiences. They want something that's deeper and more meaningful. And this is a large part of what cultural heritage tourism is sort of going within oneself to discover oneself. And all of those types of tourism that we talked about with like pilgrimage and agritourism and various other forms of heritage tourism are a large part is about, the motivation is about finding oneself. Who am I? And I have to travel to be able to do that. We still have obviously a lot of over-tourism, mass tourism, and that's always going to exist. But I think with the tourist dynamics of the current world, people do want deeper experiences with slow tourism, for example. And heritage is a great, perfect example of how slow tourism can be implemented. I think heritage tourism is a great, it's a tool to be able to adapt to these changes that are taking place, to changes in taste, changes in demand, changes in desires for certain experiences. And I think from a large part, people are always going to want to see the Eiffel Tower or the Great Wall of China. But in addition to that, they want to see how ordinary people live and how ordinary people experience their everyday life, whether it's on a farm or in a village or in a city. And so I think that we're starting to see, and somebody mentioned, I think it was Dr. Raymond mentioned, did you mention the slum tourism, or the idea that's also part of heritage tourism, because these slums are a very important part of urban growth and urbanization in the global South. And they become an important part of the urban heritage of places. And so even in that, people are starting to want to know how different people live and how, in other words, I'm going to sum it up and say, people are no longer, for the most part, satisfied just lying on a beach. At least some aren't. There are many who still want that experience, obviously. But we're starting to see a diversification of the desires for deeper and more meaningful experiences that will connect people themselves to place and experience. And I think that that's really an important part of heritage tourism.
Indeed, Prof. I completely agree with what you said. And just because something is niche tourism does not mean that it's not important, or something is not made for the wider population does not mean it's not important. In fact, I believe it's more important than all the big famous tourism sites in all countries. All right, with this, we will come to the end of this session. I will quickly summarize what both speakers talked about. So Prof. Dallen's talk today was on capacity of heritage tourism to uphold the UN Sustainable Development Goals. He provided us a conceptual framework for understanding the multiple role of heritage tourism and how it can achieve the goals of sustainable development, especially the UN SDGs. He told us that heritage tourism has the potential to achieve more than half of all the 17 SDGs. In particular, they pertain to gender equality, environmental harmony, poverty alleviation, economic growth, partnerships, and many other thorough concepts such as identity, sense of place and belonging, community empowerment, sustainable use of cultural resources, collaboration, the educative role of heritage tourism, and indigenous knowledge. This was followed by Dr. Raymond's talk on weaving notions of justice into heritage tourism, where he highlighted how considering innovation in our research and practice should move us towards not only more sustainable, but also more just tourism futures. In particular, he focused on social justice issues in developing countries, such as recognition, participation, and knowledge sharing. I hope all the 200 people in this session enjoyed the session as much as I did. With this, I do the closing of this session.